Hello and welcome. This is Formation of Europe with Dr. Schlosser for Covenant College. And today we're going to be talking about Anglo-Saxon England and Frankish Gaul. We've been looking at the spread of barbarians throughout the Roman West, and today we're going to be looking at the same in England and in France. England had been vacated by the Romans in the 400s with the sack of Rome and the increase of other barbarians around the West. And so there wasn't a lot of defenses in the British Isles through the 400s and into the 500s. And here you can see on this map an infiltration of several barbarian groups as part of this larger migratory process called the Völkerwanderung. Collectively, these groups will become known as the Anglo-Saxons in England. There's also the Utes coming over from modern-day Denmark, but largely we talk about the Angles and the Saxons together as the Anglo-Saxons. You'll notice that there are different provinces that these various peoples are moving to: Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and so on. Of note in Anglo-Saxon England is that it is not a unified or centralized barbarian kingdom, but rather it's made up of several smaller kingdoms, petty kingdoms you might call it, with each king only exerting control over a small area of what we would today call England. Britain had been Christian under the Romans, but as I said, the Romans had vacated Britain in the 400s, and the Angles and the Saxons were not Christians, and so Anglo-Saxon England remained under sort of barbarian, Germanic, pagan religious practice through the 500s. And at the end of the 500s into the 600s, this is that story of Gregory the Great, Bishop of Rome. We had mentioned him before, sending missionaries to England. This is one of his more famous examples of sending missionaries out to convert a people group. The person who leads this mission for Gregory is a man named Augustine. This is different than the Augustine that we've encountered before, the Augustine who wrote Confessions and City of God in the late Roman world. That's Augustine of Canterbury, that's Augustine of Hippo in North Africa, living in the 300s and 400s. This is Augustine of Canterbury here in the 500s and the 600s, some 200 years later. And we have recorded for us correspondence between Augustine and Gregory, and Augustine had some considerable trouble converting the Anglo-Saxons, and so we have this dialogue, this conversation going back and forth through letters. And Augustine is asking Gregory for help and advice for how to convert these people. And Gregory sends back some advice where he encourages Augustine to allow the Anglo-Saxons to continue many of their traditional practices so long as it doesn't contradict the faith. And so here we sort of get a sense of syncretism again. Remember, Gregory had been sensitive to adapting or changing the message to fit the audience. This isn't changing the gospel or presenting a different form of Christianity, but it is making the message acceptable to the audience that's receiving it. So for these barbarian Anglo-Saxons, if they're used to doing a variety of different religious practices, Gregory encourages Augustine to allow them to do that, again, so long as it doesn't contradict the faith. So things like, if they're worshiping out in a sacred grove out in the woods, allow them to continue to go there, just cut down the sacred trees that they had been worshiping and build a Christian church out of that wood. So now people will continue to go to worship and engage in religious activity in the same place they always had. Now they're just worshiping the Christian God instead of their pagan gods. You'll notice syncretism there is hyperlinked. That is a link to the Jim Gaffigan video of holiday traditions. We won't play it here, but he gets at some of these blending of older traditions and beliefs that don't really make sense in the context. So things like the Christmas tree. That seems backwards, bringing a tree inside, put all the lights outside. something like Easter. What should we do for Jesus rising from the dead? Let's hide eggs. Doesn't really make sense, but this is where some of those blending of practices comes from. Augustine still needs some help, and he finds a natural ally in the person of Bertha, Queen of Kent. Kent is in the southeast of England, right over here. It is that area where the Straits of Dover are, close to the continent. And Bertha was the queen. She was a Frank, who we'll talk about in a little bit, but she's married to an Anglo-Saxon king. Bertha was already a Christian. She had already come over with her own priest and other religious administrators, already performing religious rites and ceremonies and festivals within her own section of the Anglo-Saxon court in Kent. This is sort of a natural ally for Augustine. And so with the help of the Queen Bertha, the King of Kent is able to convert, and when the king converts, the rest of the people will follow soon after. It's probably not a great idea to disagree with your leader religiously. And so this is one way that women can often play an important, if indirect, role in power in the early Middle Ages. And this process is called domestic proselytization. And that sounds like big words or complicated jargon, but it just means preaching within the household, right? Proselytization is preaching. Domestic means within the household, so domestic proselytization is just the preaching of beliefs within the household, and often this is done by the spouse. And so this is one way that, again, women may not have direct control or direct power in a lot of cases, but with their sort of authority or influence behind the scenes, indirectly they can often have large swaths of power or influence, in this case converting whole people groups or whole kingdoms. So England is converted to Christianity, and notice that the type of Christianity that the Anglo-Saxons convert to is from Rome. The missionaries that are sent to England come from Gregory the Great, the Bishop of Rome. There's a particular style of worship, a particular trend of Christianity that is associated with Roman Christianity. But it wasn't the only one in the early medieval period. There were lots of different varieties. This is not to say that they were necessarily heretical or differed in doctrine, but there were different practices, different customs, different ways of doing it. And one of those variant ways of doing Christianity came out of Ireland. Ireland had never been colonized by the Romans. In fact, the Romans saw Ireland as cold and wet and dreary, a place you wouldn't want to go. They called the name that the Romans had for Ireland was Hibernia. It's where we get the word hibernate. They literally thought of Ireland as the winterland, not a place you'd want to live. So the Romans never colonized Ireland, and so Christianity in Ireland didn't necessarily develop along the same lines that Christianity would in places either directly within the empire or places like Britain after the empire that were still affected by the Roman tradition. So Christianity grew up sort of on its own in Ireland, apart from the rest of Europe, and particularly in monastic ways. Christianity in Ireland was particularly associated with monasticism, and as those monasteries grew in Ireland and became more powerful and more prosperous, they began to send out their own missionaries back to Europe. And so we get a meeting of Roman Christianity and Irish Christianity as these various traditions meet in places like England. And it'll be in England where most directly these two traditions kind of meet head on. There are different styles of doing it. As I said, one of the most dramatic perhaps is that there were two different traditions of how to date the holiday of Easter, which is a complicated thing, but it's a very practical thing, right? If half the kingdom is celebrating Easter one weekend, and having feast and lamb and singing Christ the Lord is risen today, and the other half of the kingdom is still mourning and in sackcloth and Lent, and the sort of dark period like that. It causes some tension, you can see, religiously, socially, and in other ways. So in the 600s, in England, there's sort of a meeting out of the right way to do this, and Roman Christianity will generally win out. We often think of the early Middle Ages, sometimes derogatorily, sometimes as sort of a dark age, and this is not necessarily accurate or true. There are lots of people building on the Roman tradition, building on the various traditions that have come before. And in Anglo-Saxon England, one of the most prominent and famous people to engage in this tradition is a man named Bede. Bede is sometimes called the Venerable. He doesn't quite reach saint status, but he is venerated for his piety and the things that he does. Bede is a prolific writer. You can see here writing on a variety of aspects. Lots of different learning, things like computas, which is sort of the figuring of stars, and calendrical dating and that sort of thing. Things like hagiography, which is the study of saints' lives, exegesis, commentary on the Bible, but he's most known for his ecclesiastical history. Bede gives us the history of the Anglo-Saxon people, but notice it's the ecclesiastical history. While Bede does tell us certain political or cultural movements within the Anglo-Saxon people, he's most primarily concerned with their conversion to Christianity and the Anglo-Saxons living as a Christian people. And so it's from people like Bede that we get those accounts of Gregory sending Augustine to convert the English people. So I want to switch and come across the channel here to Merovingian Gaul. Gaul is that old Roman province of what today we would call France, and the Merovingians are just the ruling dynastic family, ruling in Gaul, this barbarian Frankish kingdom, from the 500s into the 600s and the 700s. We won't say a lot about the Merovingians, but we need to, talk a little bit about them in the way that they set up this Frankish barbarian kingdom, because there are some important precedents that the Merovingians will set up here and things that we need to keep in mind going forward. So you can see here, this is what Frankish Gaul would look like in the 500s. The sort of yellow area is kind of the heartland of the Franks, and you'll see it expands out there through the conquest of a man named Clovis. We'll talk more about Clovis here in a moment, but he sort of unifies the various Frankish tribes together and expands Frankish Gaul into, at least under the Merovingians, its most prominent, extensive place. And this is in the late 400s, early 500s. So Clovis will convert to Christianity, and again this happens through the influence of his wife, a woman named Clotilde. And the story goes that his wife Clotilde had been bothering him for some time to convert to Christianity, and Clovis really wasn't interested. He has reasons to hesitate on that and to push it off, until finally he is out in a battle in one of these expansive campaigns to expand the Frankish Empire, or the Frankish kingdom, I should say. And the odds don't look good for Clovis. It looks like he's going to lose the battle. And so he'd been praying to his various pagan gods, the story goes, and having no real luck. And so he says, well, my wife Clotilde has been bothering me about this Christian god. I suppose that I should give that a try. And so he prays to the Christian god, and lo and behold, he and the Franks win the battle. There are a couple of things to note about this story that are interesting and really significant to be thinking about. The first is something that you've probably already noticed. This is reminiscent of the story of Constantine, that first Christian emperor, in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. That story where Constantine has a vision of Christ, and it wins the day for him. So in some ways, Clovis is modeling himself here after that Roman Christian emperor. The other idea is exactly to what Clovis is converting. The account that we have of this that tells us that Clovis had been praying to his various pagan gods before he tries the Christian God. The gods that he'd been praying to are old Roman gods, gods like Jupiter and Mars. And the question comes up, why is a Germanic barbarian praying to Roman gods when he much more likely would have been praying to Germanic pagan gods like Woden or Thor or someone like that? So it's possible, it's theorized, although it's not clear, there's no way to prove this one way or the other, but it is possible that the conversion that Clovis makes here is to Catholic small c or Orthodox small o Christianity. That is to say, like many barbarians other than Clovis, it's possible that he had already been a Christian, but an Arian Christian, and that our account here is actually an account to Orthodox Christianity, away from Arian Christianity. It's a theory. It's an idea debated by scholars. Again, our accounts are not clear. There's some conjecture here, but it's something worth thinking about. And so here you have an image of this, and notice there are sort of two levels of this, the human battle going on below and the heavenly conflict above as well. So like in Britain, notice that the Franks convert through the influence of the queen. And this idea of domestic proselytization or preaching at home. And when the king converts, as with the Anglo-Saxons, the people will follow. Again, it's not necessarily a good idea to have theological disagreements with your political superior. The other thing of note here is that regardless of from what Clovis had converted, whether it's paganism or heresy of Christianity, the type of Christianity that he does convert to is that Roman type of Christianity that we've been talking about with the Anglo-Saxons, that type of Christianity that aligns with the Bishop of Rome. And this is going to set up a very long standing tradition of the Frankish kings, what will become the French kings over time, with a close relationship with the Bishop of Rome, or who we might call later the Pope. This Franco-Papal relationship will be important throughout the Middle Ages and even into the modern period, even as far down into Napoleon in the early 1800s. So over 1,000 years. And that relationship, that close friendship, religious and political friendship between the Frankish kings and the Bishop of Rome begins here with Clovis in the 500s. It's worth noting the story that the Merovingians told about themselves. Their name, the Merovingians, their family name, comes from a Germanic pagan mythological demigod. Not a full-fledged deity, but they do trace their lineage back to barbarian pagan mythology. So even after the Franks become Christians and this ruling family converts to Christianity, they still hold on to this barbarian pagan past of their origin story and where they came from. It's also important to realize, in sort of thinking about what happens to the Merovingians, the way that they governed and the way that they practiced family traditions. The way that inheritance works is exactly what it looks like here, partible inheritance, and that means that when a father dies, all of his inheritance, all of his estate, his land, his titles, his wealth, are all split equally among his surviving male heirs. May not be exactly equally. The oldest may get a little bit more than his younger brothers, but the idea is generally that it's divided up. On the one hand, that works, nobody is left out, but on the other hand, after someone like Clovis, who had united Frankish lands, and he has multiple surviving sons who inherit that kingdom, the kingdom is divided up, and the brothers become jealous of each other. This can lead to civil war, and it does often. The Merovingian Frankish kingdom is reunited from time to time, but it never lasts really more than a generation. Before long, the lands are divided up again, and conflict breaks out. We'll keep this idea of partible inheritance in mind because we'll come back to it now and again throughout the next few weeks. Lastly, we should note that our stories of the Merovingians are complicated. Our main historian of this period is a man named Gregory of Tours. He tells us much about, so notice this is a different Gregory. This is not Gregory the Great. He's not Bishop of Rome, but he comes from the Frankish city of Tours, sort of western France. But it's through Gregory that we know about people like Clovis. It's through Gregory that we know about different struggles and conflicts within the Merovingian family. But importantly, a lot of the information that we have about the Merovingians come from their successors, the Carolingians, who don't necessarily have good things to say about the Merovingians, and there are reasons that they might have those negative views of their predecessors. And it'll be the Carolingians that we talk about in the next video. And so I hope you have found this discussion of Anglo-Saxon England and Merovingian Gaul helpful. Let me know if you have comments or questions. I'd be happy to address those, and I'll see you in the next video.